Hello, these are flip notes for Unit 3, which is about development and learning, and this is our first section, 3.1, on the themes and methods in developmental psychology. So let's get right into it. This section is mostly about nature and nurture. So what is developmental psychology? It's all about the lifespan, how we change physically, mentally, behaviorally from really before birth, even in the prenatal stages, so throughout childhood, adolescence, adulthood, even into grieving and death are part of developmental psychology. There are three big issues or approaches that are discussed in developmental psychology. We primarily will focus on nature and nurture, whether behaviors are the result of genetic inheritance, our nature, or more from our interaction with experiences, our nurture, and how those influence development. Another theory or approach is questioning whether development happens continuously through continuity or more through strict stages. So what parts of development are more gradual or continuous, kind of like riding an escalator, or which ones are more abruptly and they're very specific stages, like steps on a ladder. And then the third approach is like looking at stability versus change. Which of our traits persist through life, like our personality or our motivation? How do we change as we age? Do those things stay stable, or do they change as we reach different stages of life? We've got two sides here, the genetic and the environmental influences on behavior. Genetic is what we refer to as nature. So this goes back to that great debate in psychology, as in what influences our behavior? Is it nature or is it nurture? And we know that the answer is both, that they both impact behavior in many ways, and a lot of times it's hard to even tell which one is more responsible for a certain behavior. Another way of looking at nature and nurture is by looking at behavior genetics, or the relative power and limits of genetic and environmental influences on our behavior. So behavior genetics and behavior geneticists are really the ones who focus on studying twin pairs, identical twins, especially separated identical twins, and then also adoption studies. So review on the two types of twins. Identical twins develop from a single fertilized egg, and they're genetically identical. So any differences in their behavior are going to be the result of their their nurture or their environment. Fraternal twins develop from separate eggs and are no more similar genetically than just ordinary siblings. They just happen to be born at the same time. Research has found that these identical twins are much more similar than fraternal twins than just their DNA, but also in their abilities, their personalities, and a lot of their interests. When we say identical twins, another name for that is monozygotic. Mono as in one, because they start with one egg and one sperm that are fertilized, and then there's a division, but they do still share a placenta, which is what brings nutrients from the child or from the mother to the child. Fraternal twins are known as dizygotic, which means there are two eggs, two sperms, two fertilizations, and two placentas. So everything is two in dizygotic. That's what makes them just no different than having a brother or a sister. They just happen to be at the same time. Separated twins, though, are really the focus of behavioral geneticist studies because they can tell, again, similarities are the result of DNA or nature and differences are environmental. The Minnesota Twins Project back in the late 70s focused on identical twins who were reared or raised apart. Some of that research is still ongoing, so that would make this a longitudinal study by studying over 100 pairs of identical twins who were separated at birth. This study reported that heredity accounted for 64 to 74% of the differences seen in IQ between the identical twins. So you may be thinking back in the last chapter, we said that IQ is about 50% nature or nurture. Well, it goes up even more when they're identical twins in this case. Heritability, or some psych teachers call it the big fat H word because it's hard to understand, is the extent to which differences in appearance of a trait is due to the differences in their genes. So this is not the same as inherited. Inherited and inheritance, when you inherit something, it's because you have similar genes. Heritability is differences due to your genes, so differences. So the more inherited a trait is, the less heritable it is, as heritability looks at how traits are due to the differences in your genes. So, for example, identical twins have a low or near zero heritability because we can actually measure it numerically. Because the variation in their behavior is not because of their genetic differences, because they're carbon copies. But the difference between my personality and yours is highly heritable because we have different genes. Now, if you live near me, which we do, we live near in the same environment, our differences are even more heritable because our environment is similar, meaning it's even more certain that our differences are due to genetic differences. So looking at the other half of the nature nurture debate, the environmental side or nurture. Now, a lot of times when we think of nurture, we think of it's how you're raised. There's a common phrase in psych, nature, nurture, either way, it's your parents' fault. But really, the environmental influence begins even before the parents start raising you. The prenatal environment plays a role, experience and brain development, peer influences, culture, gender, so all of those can be beyond the influence of the parents. And of course, the parents are part of that environmental influence. So it is much more than just parent influence. So prenatal influences, nurture doesn't just start at birth. It begins in the womb. That we start learning, we're influenced by smells and sounds and hormones and all kinds of things, stress. If the mother takes drugs, has an illness, or even excessive amounts of stress, that can all influence the developing fetus even before they're born. Teratogens are any kind of chemicals, viruses, germs, pollutants, anything in the environment that has the potential to breach the placenta and harm the growing baby. So teratogens are a prenatal influence that can change a baby. Mother's nutrition, maternal nutrition, malnutrition is linked to increased risk of birth complications, neurological problems, and even psychopathology or mental disorders. That's me when just before I had my little girl. Another prenatal influence is the presence of the teratogen alcohol, which can lead to fetal alcohol syndrome. Lots of effects with fetal alcohol syndrome, including different birth defects. There are physical differences in the way children with fetal alcohol syndrome look. I always think it's kind of a teddy bearish like face with smaller eye openings, shorter noses, thinner upper lip. As far as, people always wonder how much alcohol is necessary to actually cause fetal alcohol syndrome. So I looked that up because I was curious too. But the CDC and the APA say that the mother of the child, while pregnant, must have consumed more than minimal levels of alcohol. Well, how much is that? They define it as more than 13 alcoholic drinks per month of pregnancy. So in a 30-day period of pregnancy, if they've had more than 13 alcoholic drinks, then that could significantly increase the chances for fetal alcohol syndrome. Or, and this sounds a lot more scary to me because it's something that some people might violate, is more than 2 alcoholic drinks in one sitting. In some countries, it's culturally acceptable to have a glass of wine while pregnant because it can lower blood pressure. But what this is saying is once you get past that one drink, you're really kind of pushing the risks for fetal alcohol syndrome. Another interesting study shows that it's not just on the mom, that fathers who drank in the 3 months before they conceived the child were 44% more likely to have babies born with congenital heart disease. So showing that the male's behaviors can affect their sperm and that can affect the behavior of the child. Something to think about. Experience and brain development. Experience helps the brain develop neural connections. If somebody lives in an enriched environment, in this case, they did studies with rats, the rats actually developed a heavier and thicker brain cortex. And we're going to look at a video of what an enriched environment versus a deprived environment for a rat looks like. But this also seems to hold true for children as well, that infants who were handled more or they were held gained weight more rapidly and they developed faster neurologically. So that effect of touch. This kind of also correlates with what we talked about in our last chapter with language. If parts of the brain are not stimulated while they're maturing, we have that use it or lose it principle. We talked about that with language, that if you didn't use language, you would eventually lose that ability. But this is generalizing that even more, that when brains and bodies aren't stimulated, that the baby's brains were not fully developing. The effect of peers also plays a role in the environment that affects behavior. The selection effect says that kids normally choose friends that are similar to themselves, and then they have the influence on them. But that doesn't mean parents don't play a similar or play an influence as well. They both are complementary in shaping their lives. They actually looked at what kinds of things, researchers have looked at what kinds of things parents influence the teens and kids about versus what their peers influence them. But when it comes to ideas about education, discipline, responsibility, being orderly, giving, charitableness, ways of interacting with authority, your future plans, a lot of the really big things, those were more tending to be influenced by our parents. Whereas when it came to things that are more kind of like, I think of it as like pop culture, popularity, your influence in music and fashion, cooperation, a lot of that stuff, you're influenced by your peers. So definitely influenced by both. This last part here is a quick review from earlier in the year about how we do study children, since this development section has lots of studies on children. That there's those two options, a longitudinal versus cross-sectional design. You'll recall that longitudinal studies, you observe the same group of participants over a long period of time, whereas cross-sectional, we're going to look at different groups of different ages at a single point in time. Cross-sectional studies are much quicker, they're much cheaper because you just get the study done a lot faster, but you have a lot more extraneous variables to consider with all your participants. Longitudinal studies, we get a lot of good information, but it's more susceptible and sensitive to developmental influences, and you might lose your participants over time. This is just a flashback, a lot of the same things just said. All right.